morning. And thank you very much for the invite and the kind words. Very nice to be here. I've met a couple of you before, and good to see you folk again. I grew up on a farm in Zimbabwe, and I've been a research scientist since I graduated in '72, a couple of years back. So I have a farmer's viewpoint on what information is needed and how you need to generate that information. It's also afforded me the advantage of traveling worldwide to learn what different people are doing. And wherever I go, I make a point of meeting the leading conservation ranchers, the guys who are doing a really good job of looking after the resources as well as earning a good living. And on every grazing continent, I've met people who manage really well. And I try to do science that relates to what they're doing, and I learn from everybody. As you know, a lot of the research says very different things about grazing management compared to those who are managing and getting conservation awards. And you've got to understand why people are doing that. So my goal in research is to use a whole system framework, i.e. holistic, to generate and learn what is the best management for regenerating livelihoods and social resilience and ecological functioning and ranch productivity. It's fashionable for people to talk about sustainability, but we've degraded just about everything that we've worked with, so why do you want to sustain that? We have to regenerate what it used to be, and fortunately there are people right around the world, and some who farm not too far from here, who've done just that. So those are the people I learn from. And in order to do whole systems research, I work with people and I look at their whole farm structure. So you're not just looking at a small plot and figuring out what's happening there. I don't know anybody who manages small plots. Do you? Everybody manages a farm landscape. That's where we've got to understand things. So that's the way I do business. And basically, a farmer needs to know what happens at the whole of his landscape on his whole farm, what's going on. And how good is a particular management tool? Where does it work? Where doesn't it work? And how do you make it work as well as possible? A lot of research guys go out and they do something. I'm more interested in finding out people who are really achieving something that's excellent and is above average. I like to learn from them how they manage to get to be better than everybody else. And part of the leading farmers and ranchers, as businessmen, they stand out head and shoulders above the others in terms of what they achieve. And they do so by combining things in a different way to the way most people do. And I want to know what are the combinations of decision-making that they use to achieve a superior result. And also, what people want to know is what works on my farm. In other words, you can produce information from different sources, but you've also got to be able to transfer that to a different property that is unique. Generally, science doesn't do that at all. And I really irritate a lot of scientists by saying, you guys are actually playing putt-putt golf when the farmers are playing the 18-hole form of the game. You've got to connect with the 18-hole form of the game as well if you really want to know the whole picture. So, let's get down to the basics. 90% of what happens in an ecosystem is governed by the little bugs that live in the soil. And the little bugs that live in the soil, they depend on the plants to capture energy that feeds the bugs. The bugs then make feedstuffs available to the plants. So it's a you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours existence. Unless you look after the bugs by managing the plants properly, things are not going to work. The rumen is to the cow what the soil is to the plant. And that's why you've got to think about soil. Soil is something that you really need to understand, and every decision you make, you've got to say, am I pushing my soil health forward or backwards, and make an appropriate decision. In rangelands, what's the biggest limiting factor? Many people will say rainfall. No, it's the amount of the rainfall that gets in the ground that is the biggest limiting factor. So here's some research that we've done in Texas, where you've got bare ground, short grasses, mid and tall grasses, and then a bit of mesquite and stuff coming in. The erosion is highest here, lowest here. The runoff is highest here, 75% or more in these bare ground situations, and getting close to zero here. And the infiltration, what's getting in the ground, is highest here and there. So you need to be managing so that your ecosystem is in that realm there, while most people are actually in that realm there. And you need to, and we know how to manage to actually move it from the one place to the other. Down in our neck of the woods where it gets so belly hot during summer, and I know it gets hot here too, I've been here in summer, an area, bare ground, regularly gets above 120 degrees C, which wipes out your bacteria, causes your soil structure to collapse, so the water just goes straight off. Very bad situation. Whereas a next door, just across the fence from that, where you've got decent cover and decent litter cover, never gets above 90 degrees. You've always got a functional microbial population. So in order to get your microbes working, you've got to have the plant cover and minimize bare ground. In order to make your ecosystem work, whether it's a rangeland setting or a cropping system, the first thing you need to do is to capture energy. Energy is what drives the whole system. It drives the microbes, gives them energy. They then feed the plants, and the whole thing is energy from the sun. You've got to make sure you're managing your plants so you're capturing as much energy as possible. Water cycle. Talked about already. We've got to make sure that the water gets in the ground, and so we can use it. The mineral cycle. We'll get onto this in a little bit more detail. But in a grazing system, you've got to manage in a way that you're turning over the nutrients. If you leave something to stand there for a year or two, you'll stop the cycling going on, and that slows down the whole process. So you're minimizing the energy that comes in. We'll get onto that more. In order to drive those things, you need the right plants and the right diversity of plants as well as microbes to actually drive the system. These are the things that you've got to look after all the time. And the same as for cropping, you just got to look at it slightly differently. So in order to improve the range soil health, which is what's driving the system, you need to keep those four processes functioning, and this involves improving plant cover to cover the soil, perennial plants rather than annuals, most productive plants, manage for the plants to be more productive, leave adequate residue, minimize bare ground, and manage for plant growth for as many days each year as possible. That is what gets healthy soil and builds fertility and enhances the amount of water that gets into the ground. Let's look at what happens in a normal, continuous grazing situation. This is, each one of those green dots is the positioning of a cow with a GPS through a year. It's a 3,000 some acre area over the whole area there. And you'll notice they graze nice and evenly over the whole area, don't they? Never do. And yet the science that's conducted assumes they do. And we'll get onto that a little bit more. So what's happening in each of these areas here? Are they grazing properly? What's happening in these areas back here? A whole bunch of things. We'll get into that. This is what's happening at each one of those green spots. Not in the areas where they're not grazing. They're grazing pretty darn heavily in these areas here. And right next door, this is about a 4 meter by 4 meter area. They're not grazing much at all. What's happening to energy capture there? Is it good? Might be good here, but what about here? There's a lot of self-shading on there. Okay. What about your roots? What are your roots doing here? What are they doing here? If you keep nibbling away at these things all the time, what's happening to your roots? Shrinking. Drought comes along, where are you? Dead plants. You can avoid that situation with management. So previous research is done on fairly small areas. Now, they'll go and do research in something around about this size, up to 100 hectares or something like 100 acres. Which one of these, or which combination of them, indicates to you what is happening in that larger area? None of them. because scale matters. If you put animals into a large paddock, they're going to find the water, they're going to graze close to the water, and they're going to chew on what they want to and leave the rest. If you do research on a small area like this, it doesn't tell you what's happening on a commercial ranch scale. If you combine that with the fact that most research goes for 2, 3, 4 years and then moves on to something else, does that capture what's happening on your properties? I've been working 15 years on certain areas in Texas, and we follow it year by year. You've got to live through a series of droughts and a series of good seasons before you can measure the accumulative effect of those things at a ranch scale. So whenever somebody gives you figures, find out how he conducted it, how long, and at what scale it was, before you can put any credence in it. Many grazers use regenerative multi-paddock grazing successfully. Most conservation award winners around the world use some form of multi-paddock grazing, where they have a shorter graze period and allow recovery after it. And yet, it's all too common. I've been 4 different continents, and this is often the case with poor grazing. Heavy is worse, but I've seen people turn this into that just with decent grazing management. No heavy, expensive inputs, but you've got to know how to do it. And these are the people I study, as those who have done that. Overgrazing is a cause, but it's got little to do with numbers. Everybody will tell you stocking rate, stocking rate. No, it's the length of time plants are exposed to the animals. If the animal stays too long in one place, it's going to overgraze those plants. 1 cow on 10 acres will kill thousands of plants, but 1,000 cows for 1 day will not kill a single plant. And that is the guts of how to regenerate. We've managed in a manner that disregards that information. We're going to manage in this manner in order to recuperate and regenerate the land. So how do people do it? I've superimposed on that same landscape there, where you'd put in water if it was needed, you'd subdivide the area, you put your herd in one, when it's grazed off the right amount, you move it on to the next one and you carry on the rotation, and you allow recovery. So the manager can then control all of these things, and that allows to graze the whole landscape, so you're spreading your grazing pressure over the whole landscape, not just those areas in green. They select a wider variety of plants. You have to teach them to begin with, but once they learn how to do it, it's no problem. You move ahead. And for those of you interested in wildlife, I'm involved with the Patagonia project, and after 2 years of shifting from continuous grazing to a managed system like this, the biggest problem they had was all the guanacos in the area, the llamas, moving on to all the properties that were well managed because they had fresher grazing. So then they had to figure out how do you actually control your numbers on the wildlife in order to maximize the benefit and allow you to carry on regenerating. That's a real example of how much wildlife can be benefited from improving your grazing. So some evidence. The Noble Foundation near Ardmore, south of Oklahoma City, just near Texas, did a restorative project where they took a piece of land that was fairly beaten up rangeland. You can see a couple of little blue stem and Indian grass plants in there, but lots of ragweed and stuff. So it was in pretty poor shape. Most people would come in and say, well, you better spray that for weeds, and if there's not enough, you need to plow it up and plant something down. But what they did is they used the alternative of, all they did is put in a watering point with electric fencing divided into 18 paddocks, and then they managed it to improve the plant species. You don't worry about the plants that you don't want there. You worry about the plants you do. You use the plants that you want there moderately, you get off them until they've recovered, and the system works itself. This is animal unit days over the years that they did the experiment, and you'll see it increased from that level to nearly 4-fold. This is an experimental area, a couple of 100 acres, but I've got ranchers that are working with us in the same area with 4,000 to 15,000 acre ranches running from 1,000 head to 6,000 head using the same principles. They've achieved exactly the same results in improving the productivity. The only cost was when they had to put it in a bit of water and put the electric fencing in and learning how to manage it themselves. So there are lots of people doing it. Now you'll notice it isn't a straight line there. What do you think these dips are? Yeah, droughts. We've had some horrendous droughts recently. We had 3 years in a row where our total summer rainfall failed completely. But the people who are managing well, the guys who got up here, they reduced their animals because that's part of good management. You keep the number of animals there that measures the amount of foragage you've actually got in the ground. After the drought, they were in good shape. We held some learning workshops there to turn it into a learning experience. And one of the first questions from all the people was, even the neighbors, how come you've got so much grass? The standard answer was, well, for 25 years ago, I started managing for the right species, making sure they had deep roots, and that the soil health was improving, and that there was litter there was cover on the ground. You just manage for those things, and you're up here, and things work for you, and you minimize the negative effects of the inevitable droughts that come along. So these are the things that they did to do that. Match animal numbers to available forage. It means you've got to be able to adjust, and you've got to plan ahead to do that. You've got to spread the grazing over the whole ranch, so you're not chewing up and destroying parts of it, and then spreading that destruction out. Defoliate moderately in the growing season of your desired plants. Use short grazing plants. That's not only good for the plants, it's good for animal performance. Allow adequate recovery before regrazing. This is the one area that has been neglected, and we only recently realized that the recovery periods we were allowing is much shorter than it needed to be. In most places, it needs to be about double what people were doing before. They used to be doing 30, 40 days. You need to get up to, and that's in tall grass prairie, much longer than that in the growing season and in the off-season before you start getting everything moving forward. In tall grass prairie, if you let things grow out, you can get a lot of dead material there, which is poor nutrition. You can't leave things too long. You've got to wait, and as soon as they're starting to get reproductive, you've got to bring the animals back in and graze there again. And there are ways to do that, so you've always got good nutrition in front of your animals. So let's take a normal situation where you might have a herd in each one of these. Then you can put in some water, if necessary. You put in paddocks, you take the fence lines out so that your riparian areas can be afforded specific management to make them work properly. And you can have one herd in each one of these things. That's what people like to do because it's moving as little from what they knew before. You don't have to change too much. But in fact, the people who've made the most progress are those who've combined their herds and had one herd running through all of that area and having very short periods of occupation, and it's easier to have longer periods of recovery. We'll revisit that later on. So in doing so, you can change the health of the soil markedly. You can see the hue here, how much darker it is there. It doesn't take too many years. This is from Neil Denis's place, pictures that he sent me, of how much he has changed, and this is about 4 or 5 years, to change and improve the amount of carbon that gets into the soil with regenerative grazing. And with that comes lots of benefits, which we will deal with later. Infiltration rate, 1 inch or less an hour, pushed up to 10 inches an hour in this particular circumstances. Not everybody's going to make that amount of difference, but you will increase your infiltration enormously, and that is what, with the energy, what drives your whole system. So here's your choice. High-density grazing with short grazing periods and good recovery. How much energy are you capturing in that landscape? Maximum. Plants are in good vigor. How much energy are you capturing here? Considerably less because of all this going on there. What do you think the roots are like here? And the nutrient cycling? They're fantastic. This will carry well through drought. But these animals that have been whacked heavily, they will die pretty quickly and turn to bare ground when you get a severe drought that comes along. So there's the choices. Plus, here's high-density grazing. It's difficult to see, but you can see there's a very healthy litter cover under there. Look at the difference in color between those grasses. Greener, healthier. The plants with the deeper roots and with the soil microbes in better condition, they produce plants, better nutrition for the plants. The leaves are broader, and it's better nutrition, and you handle the droughts better. A lot of people burn, particularly down our way. These are pretty close to each other, and the composition of the grass species is pretty much the same. But look at the amount of bare ground there. One of the bits of research that I've done is we get a lot of woody problems down our way, and we burn, and then the critical question was, after you've burned, this amount of bare ground created by the burn is going to decrease the amount of water that gets in the ground, right? So how many years after you burn before that gets back to what it was before you burnt? We found out it's 3 average or better than average rainfall events, years. How many years does it take to give you 3 years where it's average or above? It's about 8. So you've got to wait for about 8 years before the ability of the ground to accept the water was where it was before you burnt. Is that a good trade-off? You've got to figure that out. In most circumstances, it's not, because you'll be losing water. So, periodic grazing, tall grass prairie, good condition, good grasses, a good mix of Forbs, positive Forbs and everything. And here, there's plenty of people who are conservation-minded, environmentalists, who say grazing is bad. We just got to leave it. This is what not grazing looks like. Domination by tall grass prairies, big blue stem. But what do you think of species diversity is there compared to here? It's very low. This is dominated by those tall grasses. They get tall and wolfy. They shade out all the other plants. There's about 3 or 4 species on the right there, and there's about 30 to 50 on the left. You guys know EKG, I'm sure. This is mineral cycling. You go and measure certain things, parameters that tell you how well the mineral cycle is working, how well the water cycling is working, the biotic state, the biodiversity, and the energy flow. If you've got an area that hasn't been grazed for many years, water cycle is fantastic, but the mineral cycling is poor, the biotic state is poor, and the energy flow is poor. This is a well-managed multi-camp system where you're grazing the way Gabe Brown does, for instance. Mineral cycling is fantastic, water cycling is right up there in the same realm, the biotic state is way better, and the energy flow is way better. I'll let you guys choose which one that you want to use. So let's look at some of the previous research, because what I'm talking about in favor of multi-paddock grazing, most academics will just say, you're crazy, I don't want to talk to you, you don't know what you're talking about. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You go to the people who are managing well, getting conservation awards, and they're using multi-paddocks. If you look at the research, researchers very seldom manage their experiment to achieve the best results. They just do it and say, oh, rotational grazing, okay, we'll do it, and they do it on a fixed basis. If you look at the ranchers who've excelled, they do it in a completely different way. They have a goal and they manage towards a goal. They've also ignored the influence of spatial scale that I mentioned earlier. Working on a small scale, the impact of that doesn't come close to what's happening on a commercial ranch scale. They use small plot experimental designs so that they've got, you can have 5 treatments in the space of a room like this, all on the same soil, so they decrease the variability. So that gives a good result for those small plots. But does it mean anything to the commercial ranch scale? No, it doesn't, because there's a whole lot of things you're not including in that. This is part of the artificial conditions and why I call it putt-putt grazing as opposed to regular grazing. Also, many of them put too many animals on. Many of them try and say, okay, you guys say with rotational grazing you can run more cattle, so they start off running more cattle. That's not the way to do it. You manage to improve your grazing, and as your grazing improves the forage, so you can improve the amount of animals. You improve your management, then you increase the number of animals. And they don't proactively manage as conditions change. Because of the difference in rainfall from year to year, you've got to make sure that you change your animal numbers. Otherwise, you'll come unstuck. And almost invariably, the recovery periods in experiments are about half of what we have found they should be. And if you're running your experiment for 3, 4, 5 years, you're not picking up the cyclical differences. You need to go for at least 10, maybe 15 years in most rangeland settings that I've worked in. Now let's look at those people. Not everybody has succeeded. Some people have failed. So then you've got to learn from those people, why didn't these people get success with a tool that other people are getting success with? The biggest problem is increasing your stocking rate too soon. You've got to improve the productivity of your vegetation and soils before you increase your animal numbers. You've got to have a suitable watering system, so you take the risk out and you've always got water there, otherwise you won't have a system that's operating. You've got to learn how to plan your grazing ahead, and you've got to plan every year for if it's a good, average, or poor season, you've got to know at the beginning of the year what you're going to do if it's a drought in the middle of the year. Because when the drought hits you, you're in a blue funk, you're not thinking straight, and now you've got to make some decisions. If you've got a decision beforehand that if it gets to this point, this is what I do. First bunch of cattle to go, second bunch of cattle to go. Then you're managing your situation, you're managing your cash flow, and you make it work. Not adapting as conditions change, fatal. Because things differ so much from year to year, you've got to change. Defoliating too heavily in the growing season will actually just keep things down. And having long grazing periods where your grasses get ahead of you and provide poor nutrition is one of the things where people have failed. Inadequate recovery is one of the biggest. Expecting improvements where conditions are very limiting. Some people have got soil about this thick over rock, and they try and make things happen. You can't. You've got to know what the soil is, the potential of your area, and manage according to the potential of your area. So you've got to be sensible about these things. And those that have succeeded use flexible stocking to match forage availability and animal numbers, spread grazing over the whole ranch, moderate defoliation, short grazing periods, adequate recovery, graze before too mature, and adaptively change with growing conditions. There are many different ways to do that, and you've just got to figure out how you're going to do it. So, coming down to the experiments, in order to test this, I hypothesized that on a commercial ranch scale, using multi-paddock grazing, when you proactively manage to give the best vegetation and animal performance, that has the potential to produce superior results that I've listed there, all three of those. So we worked with ranchers in the north of Texas where to have the concept of replicates, we worked in 3 separate counties, and in each of those counties we had 3 neighboring ranches. One was best case multi-paddock grazing, plant holistic management at round about that stocking rate. It did vary. The usual case grazing, which was basically stocking at the same heavy rate with continuous. That's what most people do down in our neck of the woods. In dry seasons, you can play golf on their ranches and you wouldn't lose your golf ball. And the best case continuous, which is continuous grazing where the guys stick to the NRCS level of stocking, which is about half the level of these other two. So in each of those 3 counties, we had and compared fence line comparisons. And we chose areas that we'd managed this way for at least 10 years, so we'd got the cumulative effect of each of those different managements at the point when we actually measured. So to start off with, heavy continuous, heavy multi-camp, and light continuous. The bare ground here was actually huge compared to these other two. So even though this is stocked at double that, it actually had less, although not significantly different, bare ground. In terms of the soil microbes, heavy continuous, light, multipaddock, and a grazing exclosure. Total bacteria, these were all with a suffix of A, so they were not significantly different from each other. But the fungi did differ, very high here, a little bit higher there. So the fungal to bacterial ratio was much higher there than it was in the others. What does that mean? Well, fungi are probably one of our biggest friends in the soil, apart from earthworms. Fungi extend the volume of roots. They attach to the roots and they grow out much further, and because they're very, very small in diameter, they access 15 times the root volume that the roots do. So if they are working with a plant, then they allow access to much more of the soil to get nutrients and water. So it helps you, and they exude a lot of things like glomalin that actually feed the bacteria and things in the soil to enhance your soil carbon. They increase water and nutrient retention. They form a very much tighter network so that the rainfall and nutrients that are carried with the rainfall is captured by that network. It doesn't go through. If you kill off your fungi, a lot of the nutrients just go through and get into the water system. So these are one of the things that really work for you. And because of all these things here, they help you with drought resistance. And the research that's been done by David Johnson at New Mexico, that the highest plant growth occurs where you've got the greatest fungal to bacterial ratio. These little guys really work for you, and they're worth looking after. So let's look at the grass composition. The tall grasses, little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, are the most productive, and you'll see on the heavy multi-camp that they produced the greatest amount there. Very little here and a fair amount there. Remember, this is double the stocking rate to that. So how do you think? Do you think I'm telling a story there if this is a double the stocking rate and producing more? No, because if you follow cows in continuous grazing, they'll go for water and they'll come back to where they were grazing before, and they know where each of those decent plants, the big blue stem and stuff is, and they'll go nibble on them every single time they go for water and come back again. They just keep them under control. Whereas here, you graze for a short period, a couple of days, then you're off there till they've recovered. And that is why you get so much more productivity by using a recovery in your system. The mid-grasses are the next most important in productivity. You can see they produce quite a bit less. And this is the major producer in light continuous, and heavy continuous is still not producing too much of them. Annual Forbs, these are the weeds that people look at and say, oh my goodness, I've got to spray here again. But in fact, you don't have to, because if you're managing using better grazing management, they don't become a problem. The reason there's so much on heavy continuous grazing, remember the picture with bare ground? Lots of bare ground gives you an establishment site for the weeds, and that's one of the reasons why bare ground is so bad, apart from preventing water getting in the ground. So penetration resistance, that's the compaction. Even though this had high stocking rate the same as that, and they were there for a very short period of time with very high density, you'll notice that it was the lowest of all. Because I believe for a short period of time, if your soil is in good condition, it might get knocked down a little bit when the animals are there, but then when you take them off again, it comes back again. That's what I believe is happening. So it's always in better shape. Aggregate stability is the the forming of the pores and the spaces that allow moisture to get in and allow all the microbes to live well and produce all the stuff that you need to grow your plants. So it's very high. It was higher there than here. Basically, this is an untilled situation, never been tilled. It's native grazing land. If you had tilled this soil at all, then the aggregate stability would be greatly reduced. Look at the soil organic matter. This is the usual case, heavy continuous grazing. The green is the light continuous grazing, and the blue is multi-paddock grazing. Now you'll see these are pretty close together. There's not much difference between them. But remember that this was the same as that 10 years prior. So all of these things are significant from each other. And what it means is that the multi-paddock produced 3 tons of carbon per hectare more per year than the heavy continuous grazing. That's a lot of extra carbon. And these are the major reasons why you need to have as much organic matter as possible. The higher it is, the more fertile your soil, because the carbon hangs on to nutrients better than soil particles. But look at the water holding capacity. Everybody understands that they want to be here instead of there. And this is why you need to look after soil health as much as anything. It means so much more in terms of the amount of moisture that's available there. So all the research we've done has shown that ecological function and profitability increase with an increasing number of paddocks. We've worked from 1 paddock, 4 paddocks, 8 paddocks, 16 up to 48 paddock systems, and we have found that the more you have, the better your regeneration and the better the end product. Short periods of grazing with adequate recovery gave the greatest profit and ecological function, and that's tied in with that. Adjusting your multi-paddock grazing management with changing conditions increases ecological function and productivity. We tried having fixed management that gave the same periods of grazing and the same periods of recovery as an adaptive system that changed from year to year. And the fixed never gave us the same results as where you were adaptive. You changed things, you changed the length of rest, etc. As soon as you had fixed lengths of grazing and fixed lengths of recovery, you had a poorer result than if you changed them according to the conditions that were changing on your ranch. So the fixed management protocols reduced benefits. They gave you some benefits, but they weren't as good as the adaptive. And profitability decreases if your recovery is too short or too long. You've got to manage for that sweet spot in the middle. Multi-paddock management ameliorated the impacts of increasing stocking rate proportion to the number of paddocks. So the greater the number of paddocks you got, assuming good management, the greater you could increase your carrying capacity and the number of animals you carried, and hence your profitability. So to achieve these results, it's the same list as I've had before, but this works from, I've worked in 10 inches up to 60 inches. It works in all of those. You can make it work. Let's look what this means now in terms of scaling it up to the watershed scale. These are the research areas that we worked on, but this is a whole catchment. This is Denton, just north of Dallas, and this is up near Wichita Falls. It's about 100 miles there. The green denotes permanent grassland, native vegetation, and they have been measuring the runoff and the quality of water down here for over 100 years. Now, we couldn't get the number of animals in this area prior to 1980, so we used the figures at NRCS for the number of animals that have been running there from 1980 to 2013. And these are the results that came out of that. The red is the surface runoff, and the blue is the amount of water that comes in that actually gets into the ground. It's heavy continuous, light continuous, multi-paddock, and exclosure, no grazing. Look how much higher that is than the water that's getting in the ground, which is what you'd expect. Light continuous grazing It's just a little bit higher, but not significantly different. With the MP, even though it's at a higher stocking rate, much more gets in the ground, and the exclosure was very, very similar. So the environmentalists would jump on us and say, see, we told you shouldn't have had cows there. But remember we spoke about earlier, I showed you that patch of dead grass. What's the species diversity here? What's the nutrient cycling here? What do you think the bird life and all those things that the environmentalists are worried about? Is that working well with all that dead grass out there? No, it isn't. Because having a grazer in the system, properly managed, is really important for all the environmental goals. And the good thing about this is this produced as good watershed characteristics as an area that hadn't been grazed at all. That's a take-home message. So let's talk a little bit about high-density grazing as a regenerative tool in a planted pasture grazing situation. One of the best guys in the business is sitting here. Haven't seen him for a while, but Denis up in Saskatchewan, and he's got a really good system that he worked out there and is worthwhile learning from. Basically what he does is water here, a corridor at the crest, and you move the animals down into one paddock, and then within a couple of hours you move on to the next week, or a day, whichever works your purpose, and then you move on to the next week and go back. And they graze there and go back for water. Very simple system. He handles it really well, and he's got phenomenal results. As I said, this is the same picture as earlier. The amount of carbon he gets into the ground has started off there and has increased it enormously. And the living soil, you can see how all the earthworm activity, the biodiversity of plants that are coming in to essentially a very low number of species situation that occurred before. Similarly, Gabe Brown down at North Dakota, cover crops of 25 species that he grazes and runs in rotation with the rest of his cropping system. There he is grazing them 3 years ago when we visited there, mob grazing with them. This is in the middle of summer, very hot day, and the neighbors had almost no grazing at all. And this looks as if they just had rain in that area because the soil health was so good. And the reason why, well, let's get onto this first. Moving to the next paddock, you'll notice a lot of stuff left here and pushed down onto the ground. Is this wasted forage? No, it isn't, because it feeds the microbes that drive the whole system. You don't want to do that right through the year. The beginning of the season, you need to have light, quick graze early in the season until the plants start really growing well and start getting ahead of the animals. And then you graze for a high trample to graze ratio, so you're putting that high digestible forage on the ground after they've taken a fair amount off for their own growth, and that's what feeds the earthworms and keeps the system going. So you can change the system at different times of the year so that you're actually growing biological material for the animals, like earthworms, and they'll provide all the fertility you need. You won't need inputs. And what Gabe did was he increased, at that point, it was 8-fold increase in infiltration from less than half an inch an hour, increased it 8-fold, and we've recently measured there, and it's even higher now. So, this is from J. Fuhrer, who most of you probably know. When you look at the detrimental effects of different practices and beneficial, tillage really produces a non-beneficial net result. Direct seeding without tillage is an improvement. No-till with low crop biodiversity is an improvement again. No-till with high crop diversity improves again. No-till with high crop and cover crops pushes it way up there. And then when you bring the animals in to add to the system, you bring an extra component to the situation altogether. Now, the interesting thing is, the Germans, prior to the Second World War, had developed agricultural systems that didn't have any inorganic inputs. And they had determined that if you want to maintain the fertility on your farm, you needed to have 17% of the area under animals that you rotated. If you needed to increase the fertility, you needed to have 25 to 30% of the area under animals to actually build it up again. So we've known about these principles for a long time, and we're being reminded of them now, and it works just as well as it did back then. So you improve pasture soil health by perennial plants rather than annuals, manage for productive plants, leave abundant residue, use diverse species, eliminate tillage, minimize bare ground, use organic soil amendments, if you're going to. Many people have got to the point they don't need to. And reduce your N-fertilizer use, let that come from nature. And many very potent, high-quality journals have documented this. It's not like we don't know it, and that there's no data for it. It's there. And grow plants for the maximum days each year. One of the major reasons for that is fungi then work for you. While you've got green leaf there, they are feeding fungus, and the fungus is really working for you. As soon as you've got a period on your place where you haven't got green material growing, your fungi shut up shop. So you haven't got them working for you, and they're free. So let's look at climate change. Is one of the things that bugs us quite a bit these days. And there are so many people that are anti-cattle that they continually push us down our throats and want us to get away from this at all. But what we did is we looked at the existing literature and said, okay, you guys think cows are bad. We know that they give off some emissions. But where are all the emissions coming from in the rest of agriculture? Cropping, because of the inputs, they're coming from inorganic fertilizer, pesticides and such, is very high. The soil erosion that results from current cropping practices is also huge, giving you that amount. Okay? So ruminants are the bad guys? Let's get some perspective on this. Now, if you manage your cropping and you're covering your soil and using good forages and that to minimize your soil erosion, of course you could reduce this immeasurably. But these are things that we're working on our research now so that we can actually show to people, no, we've got to change the way we do ag. We've got to be more holistic and more organic, i.e. regenerative, to get over these particular problems. Getting rid of cows is not going to be part of the problem. And here's another thing. This is the grazing research that we've done. A life cycle analysis is you calculate through the life cycle, all the greenhouse gas footprint from your fertilizers, your pesticides, your transport, your fuel, and everything that goes into a business. And you compare the way you would manage it one way compared to another. Those results I showed you over a 10-year transition scenario, if you changed heavy continuous to multi-paddock grazing, the increased amount of carbon you would sequester using our figures that I've shown you is that amount. The amount of carbon emissions from the cows in that grazing was that. Look how much higher that is than that. So you're actually sequestering that amount of carbon. That's the net addition of carbon to the soil, which is improving the soil. They're not a problem. If you changed heavy continuous to light continuous, you had less carbon being put in the ground, but you also, because you had fewer cows with LC, you had less emissions. You're still way ahead of the curve. The difference is less. And if you changed from light continuous grazing to multi-paddock grazing at the heavier rate, the difference was not as great, and the emissions are higher with the MP grazing. You're still ahead of the pack. There is no problem there. And the southern Great Plains, because we have poorer nutrition forage down there are higher rumen emissions under our circumstances than there are up here. So we took the worst case scenario, and we're still way ahead of the pack. The problem comes when you now take these animals and you start feeding them corn. They then inherit the corn carbon signature, so they become a net producer under those conditions. And that is why grass-fed is so good, is because you're improving the soil and you're not having any other detrimental effects. And the effect of grass only on decreasing soil erosion is one of the major benefits. So, ending up now, I like to learn from ranchers. And one of the best consultants out there is Dave Pratt. So he did a survey amongst his people, and this is the information that he took away from the survey of people working with him. It takes a minimum of 10 paddocks just to stop overgrazing. Ranches with 8 or fewer are not rotationally grazing, but are rotationally overgrazing because of the amount of time that they're spending grazing before they give the recovery. To support decent animal performance, it takes 14 to 16 paddocks for a single herd. Most rapid range improvement takes 30 paddocks. The biggest decrease in workload and the greatest improvement has been with greater than 50 paddocks. And Denis is one of the guys who's really showed us how true that is. The fastest and cheapest way to create more paddocks is combining herds. One herd reduces the workload. Checking 4 herds of 200 is a lot more work than 1 herd of 800. Your quality of life goes up immeasurably when you start operating in a manner that Neil does and Gabe. Productivity per acre is improved without decreasing animal performance, and that is due mainly to having short periods of occupation and grazing again at the right time so your animals have got good nutrition in front of them. Carrying capacity and total productivity are greatly increased at low cost. Long recovery periods are critical, and you need to watch what's happening on your ranch. You don't just move mechanically to the next paddock. If you've had rain that fell on a portion of your ranch and not on the other, you need to take that into account. I managed a 35,000 acre portion on the Waggoner Ranch. We had 30 rain gauges around there, and it was amazing how different it was. You had to take into account where the rain was falling in order to make the best of the rain and minimize damage. So, importance for ecosystem functioning. Using regenerative multi-paddock grazing can build soil levels and microbial function, enhance water infiltration and retention, build soil fertility, control erosion more effectively, enhance watershed hydrological function, increase photosynthesis and the amount of energy you're getting in your system, increase the length of the number of growing days, improving your microbial inputs and fungal inputs, enhance wildlife and biodiversity, although you have to manage specifically according to the needs of the wildlife species, but it is a tool that allows you to improve things immeasurably, and improve economic returns as you're improving your resource base. I'm well aware, I've been in a farming situation. It's got to pay. You've got to have a big increase in the pay that you're getting, and by the way, it also increases your basic resources. That is the way most farming folk look at things, and it works. And it results in grazed soils being a net greenhouse gas sink, which keeps these enviros off our backs, hopefully. So to conclude, this is the way successful operators operate. They use a 3-part goal and flexible management plan to make things work. Constantly look for unintended consequences, so you preempt problems before they become really bad. Treat causes, not symptoms. If you've got weeds there, you don't treat the weeds by spraying. You figure out, okay, what caused this, and remove the cause. That is the way you make money. Otherwise, you're just going to be treating again and again and again, and you're not dealing with the cause. Adaptively adjust management as conditions change. Use flexible stocking to match forage availability and animal numbers. Spread grazing over the whole ranch. Moderately grows in the growing season. Have short graze periods. Allow recovery. Use multiple livestock species. Texans are kind of allergic to sheep, a lot of those cattlemen, but there's a number of them now who are incorporating sheep flocks because it actually consumes a lot of the weeds out there, and it's improved their cash flow quite a lot. To succeed, clearly define what you want to achieve, understand how the ecosystem functions, understand how the land responds to different management tools, understand and deal with the cause of problems, monitor and make decisions to move towards your goal. You check your bank balance at least once a month, don't you? But your real wealth is your biological wealth. How often do you check that, whether it's going forward or backwards? You can measure a few simple things that'll tell you within a year or between years whether you're moving forward or backwards. You need to do that because that's your real wealth. And if you ignore that, then you're going to be paying to fix those problems. So it doesn't make sense to ignore your biological wealth. Keep learning. One of the things I really like about Gabe Brown is he tries to learn something new every single year. Adopting that attitude so you're always looking and always trying to find a better way to do things, that really is a good mindset to have, and you'll succeed by doing that. And if you care enough, you'll do whatever it takes to make it happen. Those are the ingredients. Many, many people have helped me. These are the guys. Some of you visited them recently in Texas. And all the ranchers that I work with and NRCS partners have helped me enormously. Thank you, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions.
Question over here. Go ahead, Jerry.
Sorry.
Richard, when we were down there in Texas, I was on that tour with you out there, but I sat through one of the guys there talking about, oh, sorry. And I just said when we were down in Texas at the National Grazing Conference, and we had that tour Richard was on, but then I think, and I'm not sure if it was on the tour or one of the speakers that talked about it, multi-species grazing, and he'd been doing it a fair time, but he claimed that you could add 5 sheep per cow with no detriment and actually be a positive. Have you had any experience in that? It seemed high to me, but I'm curious, because I'm really thinking this multi-species really makes some sense as we move forward in some of these systems. So.
Yeah, that is pretty true, and we found the same in South Africa. A lot of people used to mix the two. You know, weight for weight basis, a sheep takes about 6 or 8 sheep to have the same mass as a cow. But because they're eating different things that the cows don't eat, or eat it as a secondary choice, you can do that generally. But they found out through experience to get to that particular point. But you've always got to manage in a way that you say, assume you're going to be wrong, and keep checking. Okay, if something's going wrong, like the sheep are now starting to eat a lot of cattle food, then you need to back off from that. So my experience is, all the people I've been with, yeah, that's pretty much in the ballpark. Just keep an eye on things so you keep moving forward.
Just a few minutes ago, what did you say about adding corn to what they were eating? Did you say something about that?
Yes, we were talking about the net carbon footprint of different portions of agriculture. If you graze cattle only and don't feed them corn, then under good management, there's more carbon going into the ground than emissions that they are emitting. As soon as you feed them corn, they then inherit the carbon footprint of that corn.
Who inherits?
The cattle do, and your enterprise does. So if you're producing that corn in an organic way that has a negative carbon footprint, there's no difference. You're still negative in terms of your farm footprint. But if you are using the normal corn that you buy, that has got a very high carbon footprint because of the amount of petrochemical additions that you add to your farming enterprise. So that will increase your carbon footprint.
I was looking at, you were talking about the fire and how it was basically undesirable. And up here, we get a lot of bluegrass that the cows don't really like to eat, so it lays down and forms these big mats of dead grass, and it chokes out the grasses that would come up later. And I was looking at burning some of that off because I'm trying to get rid of it so the other grasses can come up. What would you suggest you do instead of burning?
How large an area are you talking about?
Some of the patches are an acre or 2.
If you could do something like bale grazing, where you had high animal densities at a portion of the year which wasn't during the growing period, where you knocked that stuff into the ground and you had some cow poop or whatever it was that was going in there, you would get rid of that shading effect, so it would be followed by really good growing conditions, and you would add to the organic matter of the soil and have all the benefits that would accrue from having the carbon there. If you needed to, you could burn. I'm not saying burning is a bad tool, but you've got to be aware of the consequences of using a fire. You must be aware that you can have bare ground there for a length of time until the vegetation cover came back again. So is that going to work for you? If that would set things back, then you might want to consider something different. But generally, it's better to keep the carbon there, but not have it as a mat. If it's a mat, yes, you're quite right. It limits the amount of light that's getting through to the next growth, so that's a negative. So you can then manage it in a way that actually gets rid of that as a problem just by knocking it flat.
Okay, thank you.
Just, the bale grazing concept works all over the place. It doesn't cost you a cent, and you're not losing anything in that game.
Other questions? Dave?
What do you use, or what shows you that the plant has fully recovered? You said that you should be adjustable in your grazing plans. What do you look at in a plant to show that it's fully recovered before you go back into that again?
Generally, when you've grazed your plant, assuming you've done it moderately, when it's starting to come back and it looks as if it's going to be hitting the reproductive phase in a not too distant future, i.e. it's going to start producing a seed, then it's recovered. Now there's some deviations from that. In really dry situations, a plant, if it's really, really stressed, it will, instead of putting out too much leaf, it will quickly try and put out some seed just to make sure that the seed continues. But that's a fairly rare situation. It's basically get the vegetative phase well advanced to the point where you expect it to start putting out a seed head, and that's when it's ready to graze again.
So about the flag leaf then?
Yeah, plus or minus. Now I know your whole ranch is going to differ. The shallow soils are going to take a longer time to get there, but that's what you look for, and you need to change those around. In a dry season, you allow those plants on shallower soil to actually have much longer, and maybe not graze them at all. So you change things around to have that in your mindset. How do we improve this particular piece of turf? And how can we spread things in other portions to maximize good things and minimize bad things?